and welcome to Parallax, where we look at life from how we work. Joining us today is Pastor Barry Hargrove. Pastor Hargrove is a pastor of Prince of Peace Baptist Church in East Baltimore, and he's joining us today. Pastor, welcome to Parallax.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with what a typical day looks like in the life of a pastor.
Oh, I don't know how typical my days are or how typical any of our days are, but depending on the day, for instance, today I woke up early this morning dealing with contractors at the church. We have a lot of things going on in our 100-year-old edifice, and one of the things I never thought I'd have to learn about is construction, furnaces, plumbing, and all of those things. And so actually I've been spending a lot of time here lately working with the actual physical structure of the church.
That sounds like a totally different job description than what you would think of when you think of a pastor.
They don't teach you this in seminary. You kind of pick up a lot of this stuff as you go, as I've found to be the case in pastoring. You know, you learn theory, but the practice oftentimes is quite different. And so where I can be working with contractors today, I know tomorrow I've got an all-day training session with other clergy on how to maximize the potential of our congregations and develop leadership within the congregation. So it'll be vastly different on tomorrow.
Is building up a congregation one of the chief obstacles that you're faced with, or congregation involvement? What kind of obstacles do you face?
Building up a congregation in terms of, if you're looking at numbers, it's a challenge. For a church situated as mine, the average black church only has about 75 members. A lot of people don't know that because we're in the age of mega churches right now. And so a lot of what we do, particularly in an urban setting, is evangelism, is providing service to our community. And ideally, with those services comes the interest of people to want to come and be a part of us. And so building and growing a congregation is certainly something we always have to be mindful of, but we have to look at the entirety of what we do as serving the community as we are serving God primarily.
What do you mean by serving the community? How do you?
We do that. Well, first, we just have to be a presence. One of the things I firmly believe is that if you're going to be a part of a community where help is obviously needed, then you have to be able to provide some value to the church. You just can't be open on Sundays and then have everybody go back home. But we are there. We are doing things in the neighborhood, such as working with other community groups just to beautify our community. We offer assistance with food. We provide some assistance to young people in the community. In the summertime, we try to be one of the few churches in the neighborhood who actually provides healthy food for children who are oftentimes on free and reduced lunch in school. But in summertime, when there is no school, they have to go somewhere for those meals, and we'd like to provide a way station for that as well. We are working with another organization to provide counseling services in one of our properties for people who are coming out of addiction. We actually run an NA program once a week for people who are dealing with addiction, and one of our church leaders, actually, who is a former addict, actually facilitates the meeting. And so we do try to meet the needs of the community as we are capable and as those needs arise.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a lot of outreach, and at the same time you're ministering to your congregants.
Yes.
So you're preparing a sermon every week, and you're working with whatever issues your congregants may be faced with. Mm-hmm. What are some of those issues?
Oh, our issues can range from day-to-day issues. I can't find a job. Financial concerns are always something we have to deal with. Health issues. Every so often we'll deal with family concerns. There may be family conflict I may have to be called in to mediate. But oftentimes I find with my congregation we have a lot of seniors, and there's a lot of visiting. A lot of going to hospitals and nursing homes, and just providing a constant presence so that people know that they're not being forgotten about.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I sat in at a service not too long ago, and there was a period where you gathered the younger congregants around, children, basically, and laid hands on them and just ministered to them directly during the service.
Yes.
What's the role of that attention to young people?
And actually, what you saw was only a part of what we do. We have what's called Children's Church, which typically takes place simultaneous to the sermon time, where children between the ages of 3 and 10 are actually taken out of the sanctuary and into another part of the church where they have a lesson that's prepared specifically for them that pretty much deals with the overall theme of what I'm preaching to the adults for the period of a month to 6 weeks. And so every week they have their own activities. They do arts and crafts. They sing songs. They get a whole lot done during that time that I preach, which kind of tells me about how long I preach. But we have specific activities just for them.
Yeah. Now, talk a little bit about your preaching. What goes into during the course of a week? What goes into making a sermon?
Well, I'm the type, I try to be as organized as possible, so I kind of know from the beginning of the year kind of what direction I want to go into, and so I look at overall themes. So for instance, the overall theme for this year is focusing and developing a stronger prayer life for the congregation. So for the first quarter, I've been just simply preaching about prayer, and we spent the better part of the winter studying the Lord's Prayer, and it's actually what it means so that we're not just having to repeat it. We've developed out of this a weekly prayer call where our congregation and other friends get onto a conference call every Wednesday at 7 o'clock, where specific concerns are brought to that phone call. I give a 2-minute encouraging word, and then we do about 5 minutes in prayer. So in 7 minutes, you've got a nice spiritual jolt for the day. And then when I'll move from that, and we have some other themes that we're going to carry out throughout the year, but all focusing around one specific skill or one specific area that I want the congregation to focus on.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I found interesting in your sermon was that you included your own frustration into it, that you said that you were tempted to get really angry because your church is going through some renovations right now, and the actual sanctuary wasn't ready as you had expected it would be, and so you're not putting yourself outside of that, outside of the rules that you're talking about, outside of what's written in the Bible. You're including yourself and your own temptation.
Yes, I believe that transparency is key. Oftentimes, the congregants want to put the pastor onto a pedestal that not many of us are able to adequately live up to. I believe that when we are relatable and when we are real and we're honest about the fact that we have issues and concerns like everybody else, it just makes what I'm saying from the pulpit easier to receive for the everyday person. And I tell people all the time, I've never had an issue with drugs. I've never had an issue with alcohol, but I do know what it's like to be sick. I do know what it's like to be helpless. I do know what it's like to want to throw in the towel at times. And I think that it's my responsibility as a spiritual leader to be very clear and transparent, even with my own struggles.
Talk about some of those struggles.
I've had 20 years of health issues, kidney failure, 2 transplants. I've had heart conditions. I've got a pacemaker right now. And in the process of all that, my congregation for the last 9.5 years has seen me through a lot of that. And now they see me on the up end and trying to be healthy. And last summer, they saw my struggles with having to go to the gym 4 times a week and trying to run. And, I think that that simply informs my ministry and informs even my message to people and really makes me an example to people who I know are watching. So I just, find it to be very real that as clergy, as pastors especially, who are dealing with the lives of everyday people, that they see us as, regular folk too.
Yeah, it sounds like in some ways you're ministering to the congregants, and in another way the congregation's ministering to you.
And I think it works that way a lot of times. I derive a whole lot of inspiration from individuals. I know a lot of the stories, the personal stories of people in the congregation. And there are a lot of times when I look at my own situation and I say, well, gosh, what I'm dealing with is easy compared to what I've seen other folk overcome and have helped other people through. And so I think that's what the body of Christ is all about, that we are here to encourage one another.
You, at some point, and I've heard people talk about having a calling. You know, you've been called to the pulpit. Talk about that moment for you.
Well, I've always learned this, that there are some who were sent and others who just went. And the ones who just went, I think, are crazy, because you have to be called into this profession. It's got to be a spiritual calling. I was in law school when I dropped out and decided I was going to go to seminary. And was quite sure, you know, without beyond a shadow of a doubt, once I did it, I knew that this was where I was supposed to be. I've never been more comfortable. I've never had a more difficult job, but I've never had a more rewarding career.
You have a background in international relations. You held a degree from Georgetown University. Talk a little bit about life before the pulpit.
Life before the pulpit, well, I'll say that I've been preaching for 20 years, but never had the intention to really pastor until I came to the Prince of Peace. And so kind of doing the dual, being a professional during the day and then preaching on my off time was a wonderful combination for me. I was able to fulfill what I thought was my call, just to preach and to be itinerant and to travel around and do revivals and still hold a full-time job was fine with me. So I always kind of led this dual professional life. And I loved it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the travel that I was able to do both on my professional job and with being a traveling preacher, you know, just going to a different church every Sunday, but kind of being based at a church. Every church I had ever been based at always had 1,000+ members. So we always had resources. There was always the best of choirs, always some of the greatest preachers in the country were coming in. It was a big change coming to what I consider to be real urban ministry, where you're really getting your hands dirty, really having to get next to people and get to know them. It was a paradigm shift for me.
What do you get in a small, intimate congregation that you don't get in a megachurch?
The thing I hear all the time is that the pastor knows who you are. I can name almost everybody who is a member. I can name everybody who claims membership into the congregation. But I think one of the things that I always hear about my congregation in particular is that there's a very warm feeling and that everybody feels like they belong even when they first visit. And I like that. I like fostering that atmosphere within the church. And oftentimes, and having been a part of a much larger ministry, you don't always get that right away. Some people find themselves very comfortable in the anonymity of numbers, but I believe that when you are really struggling and you're really trying to find meaning in life or in situations, that you can find that quicker when your pastor is accessible to you, when you can get to the deacons without having to stand in line. I just think it makes for just a different dynamic and experience.
So when you were a kid, what was your church experience? Was there role models? Did you go to a church in your...
I went to a church, and in church terms, I grew up in a silk stocking church. Again, it was nothing like the Prince of Peace, but it wasn't a big church. There were doctors and lawyers, and we had grand choirs and all that kind of stuff. But my experience was didn't grow up in an overly religious household. I had parents who encouraged us and, in fact, required us to go to church. But on Sunday afternoons after that, we sit down and have dinner. And up in New York, there was a radio station that on Sunday afternoons played a mix of jazz and salsa. And we'd sit around and just kind of play board games and do stuff. We didn't spend all day in church like some of my friends tell me they grew up doing, or going to different congregations or having the pastor with the dinner. We didn't do that. My parents were very regular. And I think that kind of helped my experiences now as well. But I just kind of grew up kind of a normal kid, and we were in church most Sundays. I was a part of the youth ministry at the church, but I got into my share of trouble. I snuck out of a youth lock-in one night to go to a nightclub with fake ID and the whole nine. You know, so I had my share of stuff. But I think that fortunately for me, because I was not made to go to church, I was not made to be super spiritual, super holy, it made me want to seek God for myself and have developed my own relationship on my own terms with Him. So it worked for me.
Prior to your work as a pastor, you worked as a speechwriter. You did some communications work with a few different D.C. folks. You worked in the D.C. mayor's office.
Yes.
Tell me how your speechwriting background informs your sermon writing.
Sure. I love to write. It's something I do. I do it well. I can do it quickly, which is how I think I became a speechwriter. But because of that, and I love being a good storyteller. And I think all of that goes into good sermon preparation. You're teaching, you're telling a story, you're persuading some people to change the way they're living or thinking. You do all of that, and you try to keep it within 30 minutes when you can. And so I think that those early days of speech writing certainly kind of still stays with me, along with some of the training I received in seminary. But I think it's just part of who I am and what I do anyway. So it was a natural transition from writing political speeches to really moving into doing my own type of things.
So besides ministry, is there something else that you're passionate about in terms of firing up your congregation?
One of the things that's really important to me, I'm a political junkie, but outside of that, what's really key is that we are really focusing on something that a lot of black churches are not focusing on, and that is our environment. To make our little piece of McElderry Park in East Baltimore more sustainable and green and healthy. And we do that almost by any means necessary. We've gotten some great partnerships. My own health story, I'm very transparent about it because I want people to know that you don't have to eat the same foods that give you diabetes and keep you obese, that there's a different way that we can live and still retain our soul, still retain some swag, and still retain our culture and who we are, but we can do it in a much more healthy way. So I spent a whole lot of time talking about staying away from the fried foods and walking and just kind of being more holistic in your approach to living.
Yeah. Beyond just being a pastor and being at the pulpit, there's a responsibility that you instill in your congregation of being politically involved, of being environmentally involved, of taking care of their bodies, of eating well. Talk a little bit about that role, and because it seems on the surface outside the role of a pastor, but at the same time it's not.
No, it's not at all. Dr. Martin Luther King was a pastor of a church himself when he began leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott. And so the African American church comes from a tradition where we're always having to marry our theology along with our movement makings, I guess is a good way to say it. And so the civil rights movement was birthed in the church and was led by religious leaders. And so I believe that what I do, while we're not necessarily in that era anymore, I still believe that there is a lot that the church can contribute to changing our communities. And so I do encourage everybody. We are a 100% registered voter congregation, and I made sure of that. Whenever election time comes around, I take time to share all sides of the issue, so that we're not just supporting a left or right side, but we present information. I find that to be very key, and making sure also that our young adults are just active in what's happening. I don't know if you noticed at the church when you came, we still have the hashtag Black Lives Matter on our marquee outside, and we've had it there since December because in that community, young people are still having to deal with violence. And whatever one may feel about the origins of that hashtag, it is still a very important and very vital message to be able to get out. And so I'm always looking for ways to involve our folks civically.
Pastor Hargrove, thanks so much for joining us. You can see a sermon that Pastor Hargrove recently delivered to his congregation at Parallax004. Thanks for watching this extended version. It's been fascinating to hear about Pastor Hargrove's history, his growing up, and his work as a pastor in Baltimore. And we'll see you next time. And in the meantime, keep it between the white line and the digits.
We'll be right back.